It began with a meeting that never appeared on the public calendar. No announcement, no photographs, only a quiet gathering of senior advisors and a renewed conversation about what royal titles are actually meant to protect. Within days, palace watchers began connecting scattered clues, and suddenly a question nobody expected was being asked aloud. Was the monarchy preparing to redraw one of its most controversial lines? Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. The first whispers did not arrive through headlines. They emerged the way so many royal stories seem to through absence rather than presence. A postponed appearance, a carefully worded briefing, a noticeable shift in language that meant little on its own but became impossible to ignore, once placed beside everything that came before it. For years, discussions surrounding titles, responsibilities, and the future shape of the monarchy had remained buried beneath public statements about unity and respect. Yet according to various public interpretations circulating among royal commentators, something had quietly changed. The year 2026 had already been described by analysts as a defining chapter for the institution. Not because of ceremony, not because of celebration, but because of structure. The monarchy had entered an uncomfortable phase of self-examination after years of relentless public scrutiny, international commentary, and endless debate over what modern royalty was supposed to look like. Questions that once seemed impossible to ask had gradually become impossible to avoid. Who represents the crown? Who carries responsibility? And perhaps most sensitive of all, what happens when titles continue while duties no longer do? Officially, nothing dramatic had been announced. Publicly, the language remained measured. But observers noticed that conversations increasingly centered not on personalities, but on systems. Not on conflict, but on function. The distinction seemed subtle at first, yet inside royal discussions, subtle distinctions often become decisive ones. Reports and commentary from constitutional observers began returning to one idea again and again: the difference between being royal and operating within the machinery of the monarchy. That distinction matters, because titles inside the institution have historically carried more than symbolism. They suggest proximity, representation, participation. They imply connection to a structure built not around celebrity but continuity. And when continuity begins to feel uncertain, institutions do what institutions have always done: they review themselves. The silence from official channels only intensified speculation. Every carefully neutral statement created fresh interpretation. Every refusal to engage produced more questions than answers. Commentators began noting that palace communications seemed unusually disciplined. No rebuttals, no dramatic corrections, just distance. And distance, in royal history, has often meant deliberation. Soon the conversation itself started changing shape. What began as another round of public fascination with personalities slowly evolved into something colder and far more consequential. Analysts stopped framing the issue as family disagreement and started framing it as institutional design. That shift changed everything, because family stories can be managed. Institutional questions cannot. Suddenly, public debate was no longer centered on whether someone deserved sympathy or criticism. Instead, the question became whether inherited status and active service could continue existing under the same umbrella indefinitely. Constitutional writers revisited old precedents. Royal historians revisited moments when the crown adapted quietly while insisting publicly that nothing fundamental had changed. And somewhere beneath all of that discussion sat the possibility nobody wanted to state too directly. What if this was never about personalities at all? What if the conversations happening behind closed doors were part of something larger, a recalculation of how the monarchy intends to survive the next generation? Because if that was true, then the story unfolding now had not appeared suddenly. It had been accumulating, year after year, decision after decision, silence after silence. And if the institution was preparing to redefine where titles begin and where duties end, then this moment was not the start of the story. But whispers alone never moved the monarchy. Something deeper had been building for years. Royal titles were never designed as personal trophies. They were symbols of service, proximity, and duty, and for generations they survived scandals, departures, and changing eras. So why, suddenly, were experts asking whether one title had become impossible to defend? To understand why that question began echoing through public conversation, it becomes necessary to step away from personalities for a moment and return to something older than headlines, older than interviews, documentaries, public statements, and even older than modern celebrity itself. Because royal titles were never created to function as permanent rewards. Their original purpose was far less emotional and far more institutional. For centuries, titles inside the British monarchy operated like markers in a carefully balanced structure. They reflected hierarchy, certainly, but they also reflected expectation. A title suggested visibility. It implied responsibility. It carried an understanding, sometimes spoken, often unspoken, that rank and role were linked together even if they were not identical. That distinction became increasingly important as public attention turned toward what the monarchy was becoming. There is a difference between holding status and performing service. There is a difference between style and responsibility. And there is a difference between being connected to the institution and actively representing it. Historically, those lines were never perfectly fixed. Titles evolved, roles changed, entire royal structures adapted to moments of pressure without always announcing themselves as revolutions. Some positions expanded with time, others quietly faded. Certain privileges remained ceremonial while actual influence shifted elsewhere. The monarchy survived, not because it resisted every change, but because it learned which changes could be absorbed without threatening the larger structure. That history suddenly felt relevant again. As public debate intensified over recent years, commentators and constitutional observers increasingly began asking whether the modern monarchy had entered another one of those moments. Not a dramatic rupture, not a public confrontation, something quieter, a recalibration. The question was no longer whether individuals remain popular or controversial. Popularity rises and falls, controversy fades. The deeper concern, according to public debate, became whether inherited symbols could continue existing separately from public function without creating confusion around what the institution actually stood for. And that is where the conversation became uncomfortable. Because once those questions are asked, they do not stay contained. If titles symbolize duty, what happens when duty changes? If titles represent public service, what happens when service becomes private? If the institution emphasizes continuity, how does it explain exceptions without weakening its own language? Suddenly, discussions that once seemed emotional became constitutional in tone. Observers revisited older precedents. Historians pointed toward periods where royal arrangements evolved under pressure. Commentators debated whether modern expectations demanded clearer definitions between ceremonial identity and active institutional participation. At the center of all of it sat a growing tension. Personal identity versus institutional expectation. Individual narrative versus collective structure. For some, questioning titles felt unnecessarily harsh. For others, refusing to question them felt increasingly difficult. Public discussion fractured into competing interpretations, but one theme continued surfacing again and again. This no longer felt like a debate about punishment. It felt like a debate about meaning, and meaning is dangerous territory for institutions built on symbolism. Because symbols survive only when people continue believing they stand for something larger than the people who carry them. That realization changed the tone of the conversation completely. No longer was the discussion framed as who won, who lost, who stayed, or who left. The question became something far more enduring. What exactly should a royal title mean in the modern age? And once that question enters the room, history suggests it rarely leaves unchanged. What appeared symbolic at first soon became something far more strategic. Distance has a strange effect inside royal history. It doesn't always end conflict. Sometimes it magnifies it. And over time, absence can become its own political force. At first, the separation was framed as temporary, a transition, a recalibration. Public language remained careful and restrained, carrying the familiar rhythm of royal communication, respectful words, measured statements, and a repeated emphasis on personal choice. But time has a way of changing the meaning of decisions. What begins as a pause can slowly become a precedent, and what begins as distance can become something much harder to define, because royal institutions have always understood something that public debate often forgets. Presence carries meaning, not appearances alone, not photographs. Presence, to stand inside the institution, is one thing. To stand outside it while remaining symbolically attached creates a far more complicated equation. In the early stages, public reaction remained divided. Some interpreted separation from official duties as a natural evolution. Others viewed it as a challenge to long-standing expectations surrounding responsibility and representation. The conversation stayed emotional at first, focused on personalities, motivations, and competing versions of events. But emotional conversations rarely stay emotional forever. Eventually, they become structural. Months passed, then years. Media cycles repeated with exhausting familiarity. Every interview created a counter-reaction. Every appearance generated new analysis. Every public statement was dissected for signs of reconciliation, resistance, or retreat. Entire narratives formed and collapsed in real time, and something unusual began happening. The absence itself became part of the story. No longer measured by official engagements or institutional roles, public influence started operating on parallel tracks. There was the monarchy as institution, and there was the monarchy as conversation. The distance between those two ideas widened until commentators began asking whether separation had truly reduced tension at all, or whether it had transformed tension into something larger. Questions emerged that once would have sounded almost impolite. Can someone step away from royal responsibility while maintaining full symbolic association? Where does personal freedom end and institutional expectation begin? If titles represent service, can service become optional? These questions did not arrive all at once, they accumulated gradually, article by article, debate by debate, interpretation by interpretation. And over time, public perception hardened, not necessarily against individuals but against uncertainty. People who once followed the story emotionally began viewing it institutionally. The discussion became less about who was right and more about what rules should apply. Supporters argued identity should not disappear because responsibilities changed. Critics argued institutions survive only when expectations remain consistent. Both sides believed they were defending fairness. That was the uncomfortable part. There was no obvious villain in the argument, only competing ideas about legitimacy, duty, and modern identity. Inside that pressure, silence became increasingly difficult to maintain. Official channels remained disciplined. Statements stayed brief. Public appearances avoided direct engagement. Yet every absence of explanation created fresh interpretation. Every carefully neutral position generated new speculation. And institutions do not ignore pressure forever, because eventually silence stops looking like patience. Eventually silence begins to look like postponement. Observers started noticing subtle shifts in how conversations were framed. Less emphasis on reconciliation. More discussion about structure. Less focus on relationships. More attention on roles. That change felt small. But inside royal history, the smallest changes often arrive before the largest decisions. And as public expectations collided with institutional caution, a possibility emerged that few people had seriously considered before. Maybe the question was never whether distance had changed the monarchy. Maybe the real question was whether the monarchy had finally decided distance required a response. Then came the question nobody expected officials to revisit. Monarchies rarely move quickly, but when they move, they prefer permanence over emotion. That is the part outsiders often misunderstand. Royal institutions are rarely built to respond to pressure in real time. They do not operate like public campaigns, corporate restructures, or political movements chasing approval cycles. They absorb pressure. They wait. They observe. And then, sometimes years after the public believes the moment has passed, they quietly begin asking questions that reach much further than the controversy that triggered them. That possibility now appeared to be entering public discussion. Because once the debate shifted from personalities to principles, a different kind of conversation became imaginable, not emotional, not reactive, but administrative. If earlier sections of the story had been driven by headlines and competing narratives, this phase felt colder, less dramatic on the surface, more consequential underneath. Not who was right, but what rules should exist going forward. Observers began speculating about what an internal review process inside a modern monarchy would even look like. Not emergency meetings, not dramatic confrontations, something slower, more procedural, a sequence of consultations, constitutional interpretation, private legal consideration, and discussions about precedent. And precedent matters enormously, because inside institutions built on continuity, almost every future decision becomes easier or harder depending on what was allowed before. That is why public attention started drifting toward questions that sounded technical but carried enormous symbolic weight. What separates rank from active representation? How should titles function across generations? What standards create consistency? Suddenly, commentators who once focused entirely on personal stories began discussing constitutional architecture instead. Reports and public analysis increasingly pointed toward a broader concern: stability. Not immediate stability, future stability, because institutions rarely make difficult decisions for today alone. They make them for the moment when someone else points backward and says, "You allowed this once. Why not now?" That possibility changes everything. Advisors, at least in public speculation, would not simply weigh headlines. They would weigh consequences, optics, historical precedent, long-term legitimacy. Every scenario would likely be measured not against public excitement, but against institutional endurance. And endurance demands clarity. That is especially true during periods of transition. The reason timing became such a powerful part of public discussion was not because of one event, but because of accumulation. A changing monarchy, generational transition, questions about future succession, growing attention on what a streamlined institution might eventually become. Suddenly, 2026 stopped feeling like a random date. It began feeling symbolic. Not the year of a decision, the year when old assumptions became difficult to preserve. Because every institution eventually reaches moments where preserving flexibility starts creating uncertainty. And uncertainty, if left unresolved, becomes its own form of risk. Yet there remained one line officials would likely never want crossed. No appearance of punishment, no language of revenge, no impression that institutional decisions were responses to personalities. Because once a monarchy appears emotional, it weakens the very idea it depends on that the crown stands above temporary conflict. That is why public conversations increasingly emphasized a different frame. Not removal, not reaction. Realignment, not correction. Clarification. The language itself mattered. If change were ever considered, it would need to feel inevitable rather than personal, administrative rather than emotional, rooted in continuity instead of disagreement. And that distinction may have become the most important development of all. Because if institutions begin changing their definitions, they rarely announce the full reason immediately. They simply create new rules and allow history to explain them later. And if change was being considered, it would never be framed as retaliation. Royal power today rarely arrives with confrontation. It arrives in revised websites, altered protocols, and silence that speaks louder than statements. That is the paradox at the center of modern monarchy. The institution rarely needs dramatic declarations because its authority has evolved beyond spectacle. It no longer depends on grand announcements or public battles to communicate change. Instead, influence appears through details that seem administrative until people realize those details are telling a much larger story. A title appears differently. A role is described more narrowly. A protocol shifts, language changes, and suddenly, what looked like routine housekeeping begins to feel like architecture being rearranged. That possibility became impossible to ignore once public discussion moved beyond whether change could happen, and toward how change would actually appear if it ever did. because institutions like monarchies do not operate through emotional confrontation. They operate through structure. Observers increasingly began discussing what tools remain available to shape public roles in an age where symbolism matters as much as formal authority. Not legal drama, not theatrical declarations, something more restrained and because of that, more powerful. Public representation can evolve. Official positioning can narrow. Institutional emphasis can shift. The mechanics themselves are often quiet, but the message behind them can be unmistakable. That distinction became central to the conversation. People started asking whether symbolic change and legal change were being confused with each other. They are not the same thing. Legal changes are formal, visible, and difficult. Symbolic changes are often softer, but sometimes more enduring. A role can become less central without disappearing. Visibility can change without language changing. Association can remain while emphasis moves elsewhere. And because of that, institutions often prefer symbolism first. Not because symbolism is weaker, because symbolism allows continuity. That approach carries another advantage. It preserves dignity. The monarchy has historically understood that public authority depends not only on what decisions are made, but how they appear to be made. Direct confrontation creates winners and losers. Institutions generally avoid that frame. They prefer transitions that feel inevitable rather than personal, which explains why communication itself became part of the story. Every statement started being examined for what it did not say. Every omission became interpretation. Every official appearance carried questions beyond the event itself. Commentators debated whether silence represented caution or calculation. Supporters argued restraint protected stability. Critics argued restraint created uncertainty. But perhaps that tension missed the larger point. Monarchies rarely explain themselves while decisions are still forming. They allow the public to adjust first. Then they clarify later. If change ever needed to be communicated, it would likely arrive dressed in institutional language, future planning, modernization, role alignment, continuity. Words designed not to inflame but to normalize. That is how authority protects itself. Not through force, through permanence. And permanence depends on avoiding the appearance of conflict at all costs. Because once the public believes decisions are driven by emotion, every future decision becomes vulnerable to the same accusation. So the institution remains careful, measured, ceremonial, even while conversations around it become louder. Yet beneath that calm language sat a more uncomfortable realization. The institution was no longer being asked whether it could preserve dignity. It was being asked whether dignity alone could answer demands for clarity. And if public roles were evolving, the consequences would not be measured by headlines or statements. They would be measured by something much harder to control: public meaning. But the biggest consequences would not unfold inside palace walls. The monarchy may govern symbols, but symbols travel farther than decrees. And that may be the most difficult reality any modern royal institution faces. Decisions can remain private, processes can remain confidential, statements can remain measured. But symbols do not stay where they are created. They travel, they cross borders, they become headlines, debates, identities, and interpretations in places far beyond the reach of official language. That was the stage the conversation had now entered. No longer confined to palace speculation or constitutional discussion, the story had escaped into something larger: global perception. And once that happens, control becomes much harder to maintain. What made the moment feel different was not necessarily the possibility of institutional change. Monarchies have adapted before, roles have evolved before, expectations have shifted before. The difference now was speed. Public interpretation no longer unfolds over decades. It unfolds instantly. Within hours, competing narratives begin forming. One side frames change as necessary evolution. Another frames it as exclusion. Some describe it as modernization. Others describe it as abandonment of tradition. And because symbols mean different things to different audiences, every interpretation arrives carrying its own certainty. That pressure transforms royal decisions into something more than internal administration. They become international stories. Commentators from different countries began approaching the debate through entirely different lenses. Some saw a monarchy protecting relevance in a changing century. Others saw a family struggling under impossible expectations. Some viewed titles as institutional tools. Others viewed them as personal identity. And because all of those interpretations exist simultaneously, no official explanation can fully settle the argument. That is where emotion returns, not inside palace walls, outside them. Public conversations became increasingly personal. Supporters spoke about loyalty, sacrifice, and fairness. Critics talked about accountability, privilege, and consistency. Entire online communities formed around competing versions of legitimacy. Who had fulfilled expectations? Who had changed? Who had been misunderstood? Who had moved on? But underneath those louder questions sat something quieter and more powerful: identity. Because titles in the modern era no longer operate only as constitutional language. They become brands, narratives, entire public identities built over years. And when identity becomes attached to symbolism, even hypothetical changes feel deeply emotional. People do not debate symbols because they are small. They debate them because symbols stand for bigger fears. Fear of losing tradition, fear of losing relevance, fear that institutions are changing too quickly or not quickly enough. That emotional intensity created another problem. Every development started being interpreted as a signal about relationships. Observers questioned what future proximity would mean. Would distance remain distance? Would public roles continue evolving? Could relationships exist privately while institutional definitions changed? Publicly? No one seemed to agree. And maybe agreement was never the point. Because beneath the headlines, beneath the speculation, beneath every argument about protocol and identity, another conversation quietly emerged. What kind of monarchy survives the next generation? One defined by inheritance alone, or one that continually redraws its boundaries to preserve meaning? That question reached beyond any individual story, beyond personalities, beyond public opinion, beyond temporary headlines, because institutions do not simply react to pressure. They reveal what they value most when pressure becomes impossible to ignore. And perhaps that was the reason this moment felt so significant. Not because one decision would change everything, but because people suddenly realized the institution itself might be deciding what it wants to become. Yet the final chapter was never about one person. Every monarchy eventually faces the same choice: preserve tradition exactly as it was or redefine it before history does. That is the uncomfortable truth hidden beneath centuries of ceremony. Institutions often appear timeless from the outside, but survival has never depended on standing still. It has depended on knowing which traditions protect identity and which traditions become impossible to defend once the world around them changes. That is why moments like this feel larger than headlines. Because once public conversation shifts from people to principles, the question stops being who remains inside the story and becomes something much more difficult. What kind of monarchy is being built for the future? For generations, the answer seemed obvious. Expand where necessary, preserve where possible, keep continuity intact. But the pressures surrounding modern royal life have changed the equation. Public expectations move faster. Visibility operates differently. The distance between official role and public influence no longer follows the old rules. And institutions notice that. What appears from the outside as hesitation can sometimes be adaptation in slow motion. That may explain why recent conversations have increasingly focused not on conflict but evolution, not subtraction, definition. The idea of a smaller, more focused monarchy has circulated publicly for years, not as rejection of tradition, but as an attempt to protect it. The theory is simple, even if the execution is not. Fewer visible representatives, clearer responsibilities, stronger alignment between title and role. Not because service matters more than family, but because institutions survive when people understand what they represent. That shift creates difficult questions. If visibility becomes more concentrated, who carries the symbolic weight? If titles remain meaningful, what expectations should accompany them? If public service becomes the defining measure, How should identity evolve around that reality? Those questions do not have easy answers, and that is exactly why they matter. Because every answer shapes more than a single generation. It influences expectations that may remain in place long after current debates disappear. Public attitudes have changed too. There was a time when mystery strengthened monarchy. Distance created authority. Silence reinforced significance. Today, people ask for clarity. Not endless explanation, but clarity. People want to understand roles, expectations, boundaries. They want institutions to feel intentional rather than inherited by default. That does not mean tradition has lost value. If anything, it means tradition is being asked to explain itself in ways it never had to before. And perhaps that is where this entire conversation has been moving all along. Not toward separation, not toward punishment, toward a new definition of what royal identity actually means. Because identity built entirely on proximity becomes fragile. Identity built entirely on popularity becomes temporary. But identity connected to purpose becomes harder to challenge. That realization changes the emotional center of the story. The debate stops being about personalities and becomes about legacy. Who carries continuity? Who protects meaning? Who ensures the institution still makes sense 20 years from now? Suddenly, decisions that once looked personal begin appearing structural. The emotional intensity remains, but the frame becomes bigger. This is no longer simply about individuals navigating change. It is about an institution deciding which parts of itself are essential and which parts evolved from circumstances that no longer exist. And perhaps that is why the conversation has become so charged. Because everyone understands what is truly at stake. Not status, not headlines, legacy. And in the end, one final question remained. Long after headlines fade, institutions remember one thing above all, else not who shouted the loudest, but who shaped the rules that remain. And perhaps that is why this story never truly belonged to a single announcement, a single rumor, or even a single title. It began, as so many royal stories do, with uncertainty. A meeting that nobody officially explained. Conversations that seemed procedural until people started asking why they were happening now. Questions that appeared small until they became impossible to separate from larger ones. What followed was never a straight line. It unfolded through interpretation, silence, expectation, and a growing realization that the real subject had quietly changed. Because somewhere along the way, the conversation stopped being about individuals. It became about purpose. That shift matters more than it first appears. Titles can attract attention. Personalities can dominate headlines. Narratives can divide audiences and generate endless cycles of debate. But institutions think differently. Their timelines are longer. Their priorities are colder. Their memory works in decades, not news cycles. That is why moments that feel explosive in the present often become footnotes later, while the quiet adjustments hidden underneath become the things history actually remembers. And perhaps that possibility was always sitting beneath this story. Not whether a title changes, but what the title was expected to mean. Because a monarchy has never survived simply by preserving names. It survives by protecting belief. Belief that symbols still connect to purpose. Belief that continuity still carries meaning. Belief that institutions represent something larger than the people temporarily standing inside them. That belief is difficult to maintain, especially now. Modern audiences demand transparency but still expect mystery. They ask institutions to evolve but criticize them for changing. They want continuity but reject repetition. Every generation redraws expectations while insisting the institutions somehow remain recognizable. And so the monarchy does what it has always done. It adapts quietly, sometimes too slowly for critics, sometimes too cautiously for supporters, but almost never in ways that feel satisfying in the moment. Because institutional decisions rarely aim to win arguments. They aim to outlast them. That does not make the process simple. It leaves difficult questions behind. Can identity ever be separated completely from duty? Can titles survive changing expectations without changing themselves? Can institutions remain emotionally meaningful while becoming structurally different? No final statement fully answers those questions. No official language closes them forever. And maybe that is the point. Perhaps the reason royal history continues to fascinate people is not because it offers certainty, but because it constantly forces the same uncomfortable tension into public view. The individual versus the institution. Recognition versus responsibility. Legacy versus identity. Some people will look at moments like this and see necessary evolution. Others will see loss. Others will see strategy. And many will continue debating long after the headlines disappear. But history has a habit of flattening conflict and preserving outcomes. Years later, people rarely remember every argument. They remember what endured. They remember which rules survived. They remember what the institution decided it wanted to become. And perhaps one day this moment will be remembered not as a dramatic turning point at all, but as something quieter. A moment when questions once considered impossible simply became normal to ask. A moment when symbolism was measured against purpose. A moment when continuity quietly adjusted itself and moved forward. Without celebration, without confession, without ever fully explaining how close it came to becoming something else. Whether history remembers this moment as correction, reinvention, or simply another chapter in royal evolution, one truth remains. Crowns endure by changing slowly and never admitting how close they came to changing at all. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in next one.